welcome to my video. I thought I'd do one. I haven't done one for a long time, so I thought I'd better get back into it. Just to introduce myself, I'm Louise. I'm the owner and floral designer of Wendy House Flowers, and we are what we call true vintage specialists. By that I mean we make sure that when a bride or an event organiser comes to us and says they want vintage, we ensure that the details are on point. We make sure that whichever era we are representing and we are creating, that the details are accurate to that era. Because quite often you'll see a lot of vintage weddings or events are not actually very accurate in their portrayal of that era. For instance, there's a big representation of this whole Gatsby 20s thing, that it was all feathers, and yeah, there was, but not entirely. So we try and dispel those myths and help our brides and our corporate events basically put on the most accurate representation of vintage. So I thought I'd put together a little video to dispel some of the myths and help try and clarify some of the jargon and what falls into the categories that a lot of trends for weddings are around at the moment. I find that a lot of the wrong information is created through Pinterest and through other online sites that categorise things in the wrong area. So hopefully after today you'll have a much clearer idea of what falls into which area, and hopefully that will help make your wedding or your event a much more clearer picture. So if we start with vintage, seeing as that's our thing, vintage basically means it is of high quality. It is the absolute best of a particular item or characteristic of that item from a past era. So it is the absolute ultimate. If you think of like a vintage wine, it's the very best quality wine that you can possibly get from a long time ago. So when you're thinking back to something vintage, you want to think back to, firstly, what is the era that you're trying to capture? Then secondly, what are the parts of that era that made it what it was? What things do you think of that represent that era in time? And also you can get ideas from going around antique shops, watching certain programs, even getting books from the library and things like that. So, as an example of what would be vintage, we have here this silver. I use it as a fruit bowl, but we can also use it to have floral decorations in, and this can make a lovely centerpiece on the table. This dates back to 1930s. It was my grand's, so I know that one's correct. This is what we call a rose bowl, and you would insert your roses into here. This is slightly later. This was, I think, more towards 1950s, and this was my husband's grand's item. We have here two silver salt and pepper pots. They're both 1940s. And then something that's very synonymous, and I'm absolutely obsessed with either Victorians or Art Deco, and this jar was just divine. It's very reminiscent of the Art Deco period, with the geometric designs, with the glass in these sort of colours, and I've got quite a few items of these. So again, you're looking for key elements that tell you that that is very representative of that period in time. And those are the things that we can help with. Another item will be retro. A lot of people speak about retro, and retro is basically imitative of a style or fashion from the recent past. So you think of like the 60s and the 70s. What do you think of when you think of something retro? You think of something quite psychedelic, a bit funky. 80s would be quite punk, you know, it's reminiscent of that era, but it's also something that recurs over and over again. So for instance, something that would be classed as quite retro is this. I have a set of these. Obviously they come in different colours as well. This would be perfect for a very typical sort of Austin Powers wild 60s kind of party. They weren't made in the 60s, but they are an imitation of a style of the 60s that they would have had. So those are the things you want to sort of. So there is a difference between vintage and retro. Vintage is from way back, retro is slightly more recent, but also retro is something that represents an era. Vintage is something more that is characteristic within that era. Another popular style is the shabby chic. It's quite a vast one really. Shabby chic is basically, in a way, it's a form of upcycling. It's actually a style of interior decorating more than anything. So it's taking an item, perhaps refurnishing it, refabricating it, upcycling it, but something that looks older than it is, something that looks a little bit worn, but still nice, still got an element of chic, an element of nice sort of country elegance to it. So something that would be very typical of a shabby chic event or wedding would be this, birdcage. Sorry, I have a fly buzzing around me now. This we hire out for many, many shabby chic weddings, but it also gets put into the vintage category very incorrectly, because I can't recall any period in time where they've had a birdcage as their table centres. So no, this is something that is a modern trend, but it's definitely based in the shabby chic side. It's something that's very, very country, very retro. It can also fall into slightly more rustic style as well. And that would also, something else that's shabby chic, you see a lot of lace. And again, shabby chic and rustic tend to fall hand in hand with each other. Rustic is basically anything to do with the country, anything rural, anything homemade, simple, something, yeah, just those elements that they pick out. So something like this, something like the lace and the burlap jars, that would be classed as rustic. That's something that could be handmade. It's relative to the country. Another popular item that we hire out now, churns. These were huge last summer, the large ones we had as well. They're very, very popular for rustic weddings. So if you wanted to create a rustic wedding, you have to think of something very rural, very country, clay pots, milk churns, Wellington boots, things like that. You know, anything that's relative towards farming, agriculture, country. And another very popular item for the rustic wedding, log slices. This one's one of my old ones is slightly more worn, but we get regular fresh log slices in for our weddings. So as you can see, there's quite a huge difference between each style, and the important thing is to identify exactly which style you want to go for. If you wanted to blend them, the rustic and the shabby chic work perfectly together. The retro can work brilliantly on its own, but not so much with the rustic and the shabby chic. The vintage, really, if you're going to do vintage, you've got to go all in and you've got to get it right. And you've got to pick your era and know your era. Don't just assume that what you've seen on Pinterest is exactly correct, because often it's not. So you have to identify, are you going for the 40s? Are you going for the 50s? And be representative to that era. For instance, for the 50s, it's not all about diners and Elvis. That's an American thing. What was happening in the 50s in England? What were we doing? What represents our 1950s? And the same for the 1920s and 1930s. There was a big thing about prohibition back then. The styles of clothing, you know, the rationing, things like that. Post-war, for the First World War, you have those elements to deal with. And again with the 1940s. There were certain things going on during the 1940s that meant particular items wouldn't have been available. So it was a lot about bringing together what you had. So we try and kind of bring that together, and that works hand in hand with flowers as well. A lot of flowers that would be used in certain periods of time have actually progressed over the years, and the waters have got a bit muddied as to what's classed as vintage. For instance, gypsophilia is in no way vintage. It was really only popular in the 80s and the 90s. So yes, it works brilliantly with the rustic shabby chic look, but it is not a vintage flower. Vintage flowers could be anything from orchids to your cottage garden mixes like stocks and delphiniums, daisies, carnations, calla lily, oriental lily. They were things that would have really been available to people at that time. So take some time. If you're not sure, do some research. Go and see someone who is a specialist in that field. We're more than happy to answer questions if anybody has any. But basically, take your time, identify exactly what era or what style it is you want to go for, and do your research. Mixing the styles will only lead to a complete disaster. So yeah, those would be my tips, and I hope I've clarified some of the things for you today. And if you're planning your wedding, give us a call. Thank you, take care, bye bye.